The bitter wind swept across Millbrook like a warning, carrying with it the weight of something unfinished. As Sarah Thompson finished her final rounds at the Millbrook Animal Shelter, the Montana sky churned with an approaching storm, the kind that transformed familiar roads into ghostly tunnels of snow. She had just repaired the last of the shelter's ancient heating units when her phone buzzed to life, jarring the calm. The caller's voice was rushed, breathless. "There's a dog," they said, "out by Blackwood Trail. Hasn't moved in days, just standing there in the snow." Sarah hesitated. Snow was already ankle-deep, the storm's full fury not far behind. But something in the voice, the urgency, the fear, wouldn't let her ignore it. She climbed into her battered truck, windshield wipers fighting the snow's steady assault. The road twisted and groaned under her tires, headlights swallowed by white. And then she saw him, a silhouette, half buried in snow. Still, silent, waiting. The dog stood with unshakable purpose beside the trailhead, his coat glazed in ice, his amber eyes sharp and focused despite the storm. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply watched, guarded. "Hey, buddy," Sarah whispered, stepping out cautiously, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Where's your person?" The German shepherd didn't answer, but his body shifted slightly, just enough to shield whatever lay behind him. His stance told her more than any sound could. He wasn't lost. He was guarding something. Or someone. It would take nearly 2 hours to earn his trust, inch by inch. Only when she knelt in the snow, her voice cracking with a promise, "I'll help them too," did he step toward her, allowing her to lead him away. At the clinic, as warm blankets wrapped around the frostbitten dog and IVs replenished what the cold had taken, Sarah unbuckled his collar to check for ID. Inside a waterproof pouch, she found something she never expected. A note. Weathered, folded with care, written in a trembling hand that froze her blood with its final words. "Max, wait here. I'll come back if I can. If not, someone will find you. You were the best thing in my life." Sarah stared at the words, heart pounding. Max hadn't been waiting for rescue. He'd been waiting for someone he might never see again. But who was Max's person? And what could have driven a man to leave behind a dog so devoted, so unwilling to move, even as death crept in with the snow? This wasn't just a story about a dog left in the cold. It was the beginning of something deeper. A tale of war and healing, of love and loss, of loyalty that didn't break, even when everything else did. What Max guarded wasn't just a body, it was a legacy. And it all began that night on Blackwood Trail. Chapter 1. Echoes in the snow Millbrook, Montana, wasn't the kind of town you found by accident. Tucked between snow-capped mountains and endless forests, it lived in the quiet spaces between generations. Unchanged, unmoved, mostly forgotten. A single stretch of Main Street offered the essentials. One diner, one grocery, one hardware shop, and the little church where most residents gathered on Sundays, more out of habit than conviction. When winter came, the place looked like a snow globe, charming but sealed off from the outside world. Sarah Thompson never meant to stay in Millbrook. At 28, she'd once dreamed of vet school in California, a far cry from the freezing barn she'd turned into a makeshift animal shelter. But when her father got sick, she'd come home, and never left. Now, her life revolved around creatures most people overlooked, strays, runts, forgotten souls. Her apartment above the shelter was more cat sanctuary than home, and the ink on her divorce papers 3 years ago had long since faded. Love, in her experience, had edges too sharp to hold. Across town, where the forest began to thicken and the paved roads turned to gravel, lived Richard Blackwood, 67, Vietnam veteran, and in the eyes of local children, a ghost in boots. They whispered stories about the old man in the cabin, how he talked to trees, how he never came to town unless he had to. But the truth, as it so often is, was gentler than the legend. Richard had once been a decorated survival specialist, the kind of soldier who trained others how to live through the unimaginable. But war and loss had carved silence into his bones. When his wife Martha passed 5 years ago, Richard shrank inward. The house that had once echoed with her laughter became a museum of memories. He kept her teacups in place, folded her scarf every evening, visited her grave every Sunday without fail. And then came Max. He was nothing but a trembling bundle of fur left in a cardboard box outside the supermarket. Just 8 weeks old. No tag, no name. The clerk who found him said the pup had been shivering for hours. The townspeople said a man like Richard, gruff, grieving alone, had no business taking on a puppy. But Richard hadn't cared. He'd wrapped the German shepherd in his worn army coat and said softly, "You're coming home, boy." From that day forward, Max was more than a pet. He was purpose. A reason to get out of bed, a reason to walk, to feed, to speak. Their morning ritual began the very next day. At exactly 6:30 a.m., regardless of snow, rain, or the ache in Richard's chest, they would walk the trail skirting the eastern edge of Millbrook Lake. Richard's gait was slow, steady. Max would dart ahead, nose to the ground, then return every few steps, always checking on his companion. Richard had fastened a handcrafted leather collar around Max's neck on that first morning. "Structure," he said aloud, as if Max could understand. "That's what gets a man through." Max had looked up at him with wide, serious eyes, like he did understand. January 15th dawned colder than usual. The sky hung low, thick with the promise of snow. Local forecasts called it the worst storm in decades, and by midday, most of Millbrook had gone quiet, its residents huddled indoors with stocked pantries and flashlights. But inside Richard's cabin, the same quiet rhythm played out. Coffee, coat, leash. Max was already at the door, leash in his mouth. "Nothing stops you, does." "Boy," Richard smiled, even as a familiar tightness wrapped around his chest. He'd been feeling it more often lately, the kind of warning only older men and stubborn soldiers tend to ignore. He took his heart pills with a swig of cold water, tucking an extra dose into his coat pocket, right next to a folded piece of paper and a photo of Martha he kept on him at all times. The trail wouldn't walk itself. As they stepped outside, the storm met them like a living thing, snow slicing sideways, wind howling through the trees. But Max didn't flinch. His coat quickly dusted in white. He danced ahead, eager and unafraid. Richard chuckled, pulling his scarf tighter. "I promised her, Max," he muttered under his breath. "Promised I'd keep going." The snow deepened. Every step came heavier. Still, Richard pressed on. They had nearly reached the densest part of the trail, where pine trees bowed under years of weight and memory, when the pain struck like lightning. Sharp, blinding, final. Richard staggered to a stop, his gloved hand bracing against a nearby trunk. The world spun, his chest was on fire. "Max," he gasped. The dog was there instantly, pressing against him, whining. Loyal, anchored. Richard fumbled in his pocket, not for the pills, but for the paper. Not medication, a message. Hands trembling, he scrawled the note, sealed it into the waterproof pouch on Max's collar. His vision dimmed, his breath came ragged. But his voice, when it came, was steady. "Max, wait here. I'll come back if I can. If not, someone will find you." Max whimpered. "Stay," Richard said, his final command. Then silence. The wind howled. The snow buried the trail, and Max remained, motionless, faithful, and alone. 3 days passed. The world moved on. The storm raged. No one noticed the ghost of a man gone missing. But one dog, half frozen and half starved, stood his ground, guarding something no one else could see. Until a woman named Sarah answered a call, and everything began to change. Chapter 2. The Frozen Guardian back in town. The storm swallowed all sense of time. 3 days had passed since Richard Blackwood disappeared into the snow, and no one had noticed. Not really. It wasn't unusual for the old man to keep to eye himself, especially in bad weather. He didn't answer his landline. Probably lost power. Didn't come to town. Roads were impassable anyway. Only Thomas Wright, a fellow veteran and one of Richard's few real friends, found the silence unsettling. But even he chalked it up to a blizzard and the stubbornness of an old soldier. So when Sarah Thompson received a call about a dog standing perfectly still at the edge of Blackwood Trail, it sounded like just another rescue. Probably lost, she murmured to Jack Miller, who had stopped by with a cup of coffee and a half smile. Storms like this confuse animals. You want me to check it out? Jack offered. I'm on patrol anyway. Sarah shook her head. If he's been out there for days, he'll need care. I'll go. By the time she reached the trailhead in her rusted pickup, the short winter day was fading into a frozen dusk. The snow swirled thick around her headlights, and visibility was almost gone. Still, she spotted him, a lone figure standing like a statue beside the trail marker. As she approached, her breath caught. It was a young German shepherd, clearly under a year old, his body covered in frost, legs trembling but locked in place. His amber eyes didn't blink as she drew near. He didn't bark, didn't move. Just stood there, stiff with exhaustion and something deeper. Loyalty. Hey there, buddy, Sarah whispered, stepping out slowly. You must be cold. Let's get you somewhere warm. But the dog wasn't interested in rescue. Not yet. He glanced behind him, towards something Sarah couldn't see, and shifted to block her path. Not aggressively, but deliberately. As if he were guarding something sacred. She circled slightly. He moved with her. Every time she tried to step toward that hidden point beyond the trail marker, he blocked her again. You've been out here a long time, haven't you? She murmured. What are you guarding? It took nearly 2 hours to earn his trust. She stayed low, offered jerky from her coat pocket, and spoke in that gentle, practiced voice that had calmed so many scared animals before. But this dog, this Max, though she didn't yet know his name, was different. He didn't flinch from the cold. He didn't seek shelter. He was on duty. I want to help them too, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. I promise. That promise made the difference. The dog stepped forward, hesitant, shaking, and allowed her to slip a leash around his neck. Even then, he kept looking back, watching, mourning. Back at the shelter, she cradled him in her arms despite his size. Dr. Emily Parker had just finished her shift at the veterinary clinic when Sarah burst through the door. Found him at Blackwood Trail, Sarah explained breathlessly. Been out there at least 2 days. Frostbite on his paws. Dehydrated. Emily sprang into action. Together they lifted the German shepherd onto the exam table. The dog lay still, watching them with wary but intelligent eyes. He didn't resist. As Emily inserted an IV, didn't protest the needles or the cold metal of the stethoscope, but every time Sarah moved toward the door, his ears twitched. His eyes followed. He's young, Emily observed. 8 or 9 months, well cared for, and until recently. Look at this collar. Sarah examined the leather. Custom-made, strong. The kind of thing someone would buy for a dog they loved. There's something else, she said softly. He wouldn't let me near a spot on the trail. Just stood there, guarding it, wouldn't move. Emily's brow furrowed. In this weather, that's more than unusual. That's devotion. He must have been standing in that snow for days, Sarah whispered. It's a miracle he's alive. The plan was to stabilize the dog, then return to the trail. But the storm wasn't finished with Millbrook. Roads were closing again. More snow was coming. Emily shook her head. Whatever he was guarding has been out there this long. It'll be there tomorrow. He needs overnight care. By midnight, Sarah had settled the dog into a heated kennel at the shelter, equipment from the clinic rigged carefully around him. He still refused to sleep. Every sound sent his ears flicking. Every shadow made him stir. When she stood to leave, he whined, low, pleading. I'm just going upstairs, she assured him, pointing above. I live right here. I'll hear you. But her own sleep didn't come. All she could see was that dog, half frozen, standing sentry in the storm, waiting for someone who never came. At dawn, the clouds cleared. Sarah didn't wait. She called Jack. She called Thomas, and then she called Emily. "We're going back," she said. "Something's out there." Thomas arrived first, pulling up in his ancient truck, looking more worried than she'd ever seen him. "Heard you found a shepherd out by Blackwood Trail," he said without preamble. "Might be Richard's dog. He called me 3 days ago, said the storm wouldn't stop their routine." Sarah led him into the shelter. The dog was awake, standing. The moment Thomas stepped into view, the dog's ears perked. "That's Max?" Thomas confirmed. His voice broke slightly. "Richard's pup got him last spring, right after Martha's anniversary." Max barked once, low and sharp. Not a warning, but a greeting. Sarah swallowed hard. "He wouldn't let me near whatever he was guarding. I think it might have been Richard." Thomas turned pale. "Then we need to go. Now." Jack's cruiser arrived moments later. Max sat in the back seat staring out the window with an intensity that unnerved them all. "If Richard's been out there for 3 days," Jack said, "we're not talking about a rescue. We're talking about a recovery." Sarah shook her head. "We don't know that." But deep down, she feared it was true. At the trailhead, Max exploded from the car the moment the door opened. He didn't hesitate. He bolted down the path, stopping only to look back, urging them forward. Sarah pointed to the spot. "This is where he stopped me, right here." Max began pawing at the snow. Jack and Thomas joined in, brushing it away, revealing nothing. "There's nothing here," Jack said, confused. But Sarah wasn't looking at the snow. She was watching Max. He moved again, a few feet to the side, and began digging with renewed urgency. They followed. A bottle emerged, a prescription, nitroglycerin. Richard Blackwood. Thomas staggered. He dropped this when he collapsed. Sarah stared at Max. "Where is he, boy? Where's Richard?" Max turned and ran, and they followed. Snow crunched beneath their boots as Max led them deeper into the pines, further from the town, further from the known. He would trot ahead, then pause, looking back with urgency, as if pleading, "Hurry." His paws punched paths through snow that hadn't been touched in days, and Sarah, Jack, and Thomas followed without question, hearts pounding with the unspoken fear that they might already be too late. Finally, Max stopped. He stood before a cluster of dense pines, their branches bowed, low and heavy with white. Beneath one of them, just barely visible in the shadows, was a crude mound of packed snow. Sarah gasped. Jack rushed forward. A coat sleeve jutted from beneath the snowbank, frozen stiff, nearly buried completely. "Richard," Jack called, voice cracking. Max barked once, sharp and piercing. They cleared the snow as carefully as urgency allowed. Beneath the makeshift cave of snow was Richard Blackwood, still pale, and so quiet it was hard to believe life still moved inside him. Jack pressed trembling fingers to Richard's neck. Silence. Then a beat, then another. "He's alive," Jack whispered in disbelief. "He's barely hanging on, but he's alive." Sarah was already on her phone, calling emergency services, her voice shaking. Thomas knelt beside his friend, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You stubborn old goat," he muttered. "You did it. You survived." Richard had built himself a snow shelter, packing the snow around him, trapping what little body heat he had left. A war veteran's instinct, a survivalist's final stand. Max hadn't left his side, not once. The wait for the rescue team felt like another eternity. Sarah stayed beside Max, who refused to budge from Richard's chest. Jack gave up his heavy coat, laying it over the old man. They whispered, they prayed, they waited, and when the rescue sled finally arrived and the medics rushed in, Sarah made sure they heard her loud and clear. "He's not going anywhere without the dog. Max stays." To her surprise, the paramedics didn't argue. "After what he's done," one said, "separating them would be cruel." The ride back was slow, methodical. Every bump a risk for the man who defied death beneath a pine tree. At the hospital, Richard was rushed into emergency care. Max remained glued to the waiting room door, sitting in perfect silence. When a staff member tried to usher him out, Sarah's voice hardened. He's a service dog. Emotional support. He stays. It was a lie. A necessary one. When Jack arrived, later with food, Sarah barely touched it. Her mind was racing, so was her heart. We don't even know if he's going to make it, she whispered. And if he doesn't, what happens to Max? Jack hesitated. There's something else, he said. While you were driving in, I went back to the trail. She looked up, confused. I found something in the shelter. A journal. Protected. In a plastic bag. Most of it's weather notes, wildlife sightings, but the last entry? He handed her a page, the ink shaky, almost frozen. January 15th. Chest pain worse. Should have stayed home. Max needed his walk. Saw development stakes. By the lake again. If Anderson's resort goes through, we lose the old oak. That was Martha's tree, where we had our first picnic. Some things shouldn't be sold. Some places should stay untouched. Sarah's eyes widened. Development? She asked. Jack nodded grimly. Mayor Anderson's been pushing a resort. Golf. Course, spa, condos, the whole thing. Most of the landowners caved. Richard didn't. Sarah stared at the note again. He wasn't just an old man resisting change. He was protecting something. Jack's expression softened. And the town saw him as a roadblock. But he had a reason, Sarah whispered. He wasn't just saying no, he was saying not like this. Later that night, unable to rest, Sarah drove to Richard's cabin with Max by her side. The place was simple, clean, silent. Not the home of a recluse. The bookshelves were filled with journals, nature guides, and war memoirs. The walls bore framed photos, mostly of Martha, but also of Max. Recent ones. Joyful ones. She found a file labeled Land in the office drawer. Inside was a document that made her breath catch. A conservation easement, legally filed with the state of Montana. It permanently restricted development on the property. No resorts, no construction. Not now. Not ever. It had been submitted 3 months earlier. There was more. Tucked behind it, she found architectural blueprints, carefully sketched and labeled. Millbrook Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education Center. Richard's vision wasn't just about preservation. It was about legacy. A center to care for injured animals, trails for the community, an education space for children, real jobs, real purpose. Without tearing the land apart, attached to the plans was a letter to the Millbrook Town Council. For 95 years, the Blackwood family has cared for this land. While I've declined commercial offers, I've always intended for this place to serve. The people of Millbrook enclosed are plans for a wildlife center, a place of healing, of learning, a better future, not at nature's expense. I hope we can build something lasting. Respectfully, Richard Blackwood, dated January 14th, the day before his collapse. He'd never had the chance to deliver it. Sarah sat in stunned silence, Max resting at her feet. She looked down at him and whispered, "He wasn't trying to stop progress, he was showing us a different kind." She called Jack. "We have something big, and tomorrow, we take it to the town." The meeting at Town Hall had already begun by the time Sarah, Jack, and Thomas arrived, the scent of coffee and tension filling the crowded room. Outside, the snow continued to fall in heavy, wet clumps, but inside, the storm was political. Mayor Robert Anderson stood at the front, his tailored suit stark against the faded wood-paneled walls, speaking in smooth, confident tones about progress, jobs, and Millbrook's future. "We all care about Richard Blackwood," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "We hope he recovers, but we also have to think about what comes next. If Richard can't manage the property any longer, the responsible thing is to ensure that land benefits the community. A resort means real revenue, real stability." There were nods and a few frowns. Then Sarah stood, with Max by her side, silent but commanding. "I have something to share," she said, holding up the folder in her hand. The mayor opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jack stepped forward and cleared his throat loudly, just enough to silence the room. Sarah walked to the front. "This," she said, opening the folder, "is a legally filed conservation easement. Richard protected his land 3 months ago. It can't be developed, not by anyone, not even if he's gone." Murmurs rippled through the room. "And this," she continued, holding up the second document, "is what he did want to do. His vision. A wildlife rehabilitation and education center, built for the people of Millbrook, for the animals, for the next generation." She handed the documents to the town clerk. He had funding, plans, a full proposal. It was supposed to be delivered the day after his heart attack. Mayor Anderson's face turned to stone. "Miss Thompson, with all due respect—" "With all due respect," she interrupted, "you've been trying to turn this town into something it isn't. Richard wasn't blocking progress. He was offering purpose." Jack stepped forward. "Mayor, you pushed a vote while Richard was in a coma. That vote doesn't hold, and you knew he hadn't agreed to sell." The mayor looked around the room, saw the eyes on him, no longer convinced. Sarah stepped aside. "Let's vote again. This time, with the truth." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Thomas stood. "All in favor of honoring Richard's vision?" One hand went up, then another, then nearly all. Anderson's support had collapsed like a house of cards. Later that night, the snow finally stopped. Sarah and Max stood on the porch of Richard's cabin, watching the trees sway in the windless dark. Inside, the wood stove crackled. The world felt quieter, as if something had shifted, something important. Then her phone buzzed, a message from Dr. Lawrence at the hospital. "He's awake. You should come now." Sarah didn't waste a second. Richard. Blackwood was pale, thinner, and looked as though he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. But he was alive, sitting up, weakly sipping water, surrounded by machines, but awake. Max sat perfectly still beside the bed, his tail giving the smallest wag when Richard reached out a trembling hand. "You waited," he whispered. "Didn't you, boy?" Sarah wiped her eyes. "Yes, for 3 days. In the cold. He never moved. Wouldn't leave your side." Richard turned his eyes toward her, slow and deliberate. "Thank you," she smiled. "We saved what you were trying to build. The land. The wildlife center. It's going forward. The town voted for it." The old man's eyes glistened. "Martha would have liked that," he said. The next few weeks passed in a quiet blur. Sarah moved into the cabin temporarily to care for Max and prepare it for Richard's eventual return. Jack coordinated the town's formal rejection of the resort development. Thomas began organizing volunteers for the Wildlife Center's construction, but something had changed in Millbrook. People were kinder. They helped more. They came by the shelter in greater numbers. A child dropped off a jar of coins labeled, "For the Center." A local contractor offered to donate his time to build the observation deck Richard had designed. Even Mayor Anderson, now stripped of his momentum, publicly endorsed the center, more out of survival than sincerity. And Max? Max became a symbol, the dog who waited. Children drew pictures of him. Old men nodded at him with respect. He visited the school with Sarah, where a little boy asked, "How did he know not to leave?" And Sarah, blinking back tears, said softly, "Because some hearts don't break. They hold on." By spring, Richard had grown strong enough to come home. Max met him at the door, body trembling with joy but calm, as if aware of the fragility in his master's bones. Richard wheeled himself through the doorway, stopping to rest a hand on the carved frame. "Martha built this with me," he said. "Our first winter." Sarah nodded. "Now it's your forever home in the heart of something bigger." She led him outside, down the new gravel path to the edge of the forest. There, under the great oak tree that once shaded his and Martha's picnic blanket, stood a brand new sign, "Blackwood Wildlife Center, where healing begins." Richard reached out, touched the wood, closed his eyes. "I thought I lost everything," he said quietly. Sarah didn't respond. She just stood beside him with Max on his other side. "You didn't," she finally whispered. "You were just waiting to come home." 1 year later, the first day of spring arrived in Millbrook. Not with fanfare, but with sunlight spilling gently across the thawing earth, the lake glittering beneath skies finally free of gray. Richard Blackwood sat beneath the old oak, a blanket draped across his lap, Max at his side. His cane leaned against the bench, unused for the moment, because this was a moment for stillness, not movement. The bench had a new plaque now, carved carefully in brass. Martha's View, where heaven touches earth. Behind them stood the completed Blackwood Wildlife Rehabilitation and Education Center, built with local hands and fueled by the story of a man who refused to sell out, and a dog who refused to leave. 12 full-time employees. 2 bald eagles, rescued. 5 kids already enrolled in a weekend conservation workshop. And a community rediscovering its roots, not in concrete and condos, but in caretaking and connection. Inside the center's main hallway hung a framed photograph. Max, standing in the snow beside the trail marker, eyes fixed forward, ears alert, body trembling with cold but unshaken in duty. Underneath the image was a single quote: "Loyalty isn't about staying when it's easy, it's about standing guard when no one else will." Visitors often stopped there the longest, especially veterans, especially kids, especially those who knew what it felt like to be left behind. Richard often joked that Max was the true founder of the center. "He kept the mission alive when I couldn't," he'd say. "He was the heartbeat of it all." Sarah, now officially director of operations, kept her apartment above the shelter but spent most days out at the lake, overseeing programs, managing volunteers, and walking the trail Max once guarded alone. She never forgot that morning, the frozen wind, the stillness in his stance, the way he blocked her path until she understood. Some truths require patience. Some stories wait to be found, and some heroes wear fur. As the sun dipped lower, Richard turned to Max. "You remember, don't you? That day in the snow?" Max didn't answer, of course. He didn't need to. His head tilted just slightly and his tail gave one soft thump against the bench. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," Richard whispered. "And the town knows it now." He looked out at the lake, eyes misting. "I used to think Martha sent you to watch over me. Maybe she did. But maybe, just maybe, you were always meant to be here, for all of us." Max licked his hand once, then rested his head on Richard's knee. And in that golden moment, where grief met peace and loyalty met legacy, the silence spoke volumes. This wasn't just the end of a story, it was the beginning of what came after. In the next episode, we'll follow Max as he faces a new challenge, one that could change the fate of an entire town again. Because some stories don't end. They echo, they wait, they protect,